Thanks so much for coming back. For those of you who've just joined the afternoon session, I'd just like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. The official ANU acknowledgement is that we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to their elders past and present. And I guess I'd just like to add to that those of us here in Canberra at least meet on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and these are lands over which sovereignty has never been ceded, and so just to recognise that we are meeting on stolen land. Look, for those of you who haven't come across me before, I'm Maria Hines, and you'll see my face a couple of times this afternoon just introducing people. But really what I want to do at the moment is to hand over to Simon Copland, who's a PhD candidate in sociology here at the ANU. He's studying online men's rights groups and communities of the manosphere. Look, Simon has expertise in the far right, in masculinity, in online hate, and he also has a master's in science communication, and he's going to be doing the chairing today. And so, Simon, I'll hand over to you and you can take over from here.
Thank you, Maria, and welcome everybody, and thank you to the panellists for this session. So this session is going to be slightly different to the one that we had previously. The previous session was talking sort of about the role of the sociologist. In this session, we're going to be talking about the ways that sociology can intervene in policy debates, and specifically in this instance in the policy debate around digital platforms and the regulation of digital platforms, which is one of the most prominent public policy debates at the moment, and particularly has just reared its head again in the Australian context, with the Australian government recently or yesterday announcing new legislation to supposedly stop trolling online, supposedly in very much my position on that it seems to be another sort of weak attempt to achieve these things. But what I wanted to do with this panel is to get some great scholars from our school together to think actively about the different ways that regulation occurs of digital platforms across a different array of topics, and to think about the role that sociology can play in intervening in these debates. What we're going to be doing is, this is a little bit more of a traditional panel discussion. So the four of us are going to speak present papers that will range from about 10 to 15 minutes long on this topic. And then we'll have a chance for discussion at the end. I don't think I've said this to the panelists before, but what I'd like the panelists to do is maybe think, as you're listening to everybody's presentations, about some questions you might have for the other panelists. We might start with a little discussion between us as a group before we go open to questions from everybody else. Just a reminder that there's a Q&A function in this that you can use to ask questions. I'll be monitoring that as we go through the session, and I'll keep an eye on that. And there's also the chat function there if you'd like to put in any comments to any of the panelists as we go along. So the running order is going to be Jenny Davis, then Jessie Lou, then Sean Ward, and then myself. So I will start with Jenny, and I've got like multiple screens with different bios opened up, and now I've just got to get Jenny's again. But we'll start off with Dr. Jenny Davis, who is a sociologist at the Australian National University. Her work intersects social psychology and technology studies, and she's a chief investigator on the Humanising Machine Intelligence project, and she's the project lead on the role-taking project and an ARC DECRA fellow, conducting research into ethics within the Australian startup ecosystem. That says Jenny's a very high achiever and is a real expert in a lot of these fields. I'm not going to go through everybody's abstracts as to introduce them, but I'm just going to hand over to Jenny, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks so much, Simon, and thanks, Maria, for introducing us. And also thanks to Jessie and Sean for letting me hang out on your panel today. I'm really looking forward to everybody else's papers, and I'm feeling really lucky that I get to go first and then just kind of hang out and listen to all the brilliance that will come afterwards. So I will go ahead. Can I share my screen? Is that is that a thing I can do? Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay, so what I'll be presenting on today is research from my Decker project, which focuses on ethics in the Australian technology startup ecosystem. I'm in the third year of this project, and so I've been busy with field work. But this is sort of the first real presentation that I've done with it, and I'll be really interested to get sort of thoughts and feedback afterwards or in the hallways for as long as we're allowed to be together in the hallways again. So a bit about the project. Since July 2019, I've been talking with founders, funders, consultants, people who operate incubators and accelerators, representatives from government and nonprofit organizations, and sort of anyone else affiliated at all with the startup sector who will let me talk with them. I've also visited co-working hubs in Sydney, attended mostly virtual panels that are sort of startup related, and gone to mostly, again, virtual meetups and networking events for people in the startup sector. And with these data, what I'm trying to broadly understand is how social considerations operate in this ecosystem. And one element of that is understanding at a really basic level the cultural norms and practices at play. Again, this is sort of what sociologists do. This focus on and question about cultural norms and practices is what will drive the presentation today. So through my time in the field, one thing that really has stood out is the celebratory relation to failure in Australian tech startup culture. And this operates in service of an imperative to speed. And so I've come to refer to this in my head. We can talk about the nomenclature, but I've come to refer to this as the failure speed duo. This goes beyond resilience and hustle. And it's not just an acceptance of failure, but a revering of it. It's not just working efficiently, but outpacing thought with action. It instructs and underpins a custom of trying things before they're ready, testing things in a live market, and ostensibly succeeding through a rapid series of duds and disasters. This norm in practice is morally tinged and acculturated through mentorships, expert advice, and accelerator programs tied to financial opportunity. One example of this comes from an interview with a GM of a not-for-profit innovation-oriented organization who's also a founding member of the Connected Accelerator program, as well as being an investor himself. And we were talking in our conversation about avoiding unintended consequences, especially the negative ones, right? And he said, to some extent, unforeseen consequences are inherent in innovation, because one of the things I like to emphasize to people is that when you're doing something new, you don't fully know what will happen, right? It's just sort of by definition. Now, one approach to that is to analyze and plan a lot before you start, but that has some severe disadvantages and it's not always suitable. The other approach is what we typically encourage people to do, which is to be very agile. So when you discover a potential consequence you weren't previously aware of, you need to be agile about responding to that, if that makes sense. So say we realized there was a privacy problem with something we were doing. And for me, the question is, what are you going to do about it rather than should it ever have happened? This sentiment is further normalized and cultivated in a virtual panel I attended of women tech entrepreneurs. It was cultivated both through the words of the panelists themselves, but also through the collective affective orientation from co-panel members and audience participants. So here's a brief excerpt from my field notes that kind of exemplifies what I'm talking about. So the moderator poses a question and says, let's go to failure now. What were your most challenging failures and how did you overcome them? And I should say every panel I attended talked about failure and it had something very similar to this interaction. So all of the panelists smile knowingly. One jumps in and says her failures have been many, laughing as she recounts a shuttered business. We promised tech we just couldn't deliver, she says with a shrug. A second participant chimes in and says, at our company, we don't like to call them failures. We think of them as painful learnings. There have been a lot of learnings around the tech, pricing, and staff. Panelists and moderators all laugh together. The chat starts filling up with words of encouragement and supportive emojis, smiley faces, hearts, praise hands. Panelist 3 joins in. I agree, she says. The only failure is not trying. Later, this panelist would offer the advice to stop worrying about getting everything right, to just start. and the other two panelists together in unison evoke the Nike slogan, "To just do it." This failure speed duo is not endemic to the Australian startup ecosystem, but imported from global big tech cultures. Think about Facebook's move fast and break things, Google's launch early, launch often, and the bias towards action that Greg, Neff, and others document in Silicon Valley, and that Lily Irani traces to the design and innovation cultures of India's entrepreneurial scene. This ideological diaspora is a function of broader globalization, a blurring of geographic boundaries, and as I found with many of my participants, a literal movement between Australia and global tech hubs in India, Europe, and especially the US, along with professional shifts between big tech companies and entrepreneurial ventures. The rationale behind this failure speed duo is that it's generative for both innovation and economic growth. What this rationale misses, however, is the ways tech failures in particular are not just economically damaging, but have reverberating social effects. In the more benign cases, which actually are a lot of what I see in my data because I'm dealing with startups, but in the more benign cases, this can mean socially beneficial projects never get off the ground. As I said, my interviews are replete with stories of tech for good ventures that nobody would use, with discarded companies, stagnant programs, and efforts moved to the back burner where they bubble down until forgotten. However, recall that the failure speed duo is not an Australian startup invention, but an import from global big tech. In the context of big tech, the effects of failure can be and have been profoundly harmful. What we see then is a reinforcing loop in which big tech norms inform small tech practices, which feed back into this failure speed coupling that materializes in the hardware, software, applications, and devices that populate and shape daily life. So where does this leave us in terms of policy, the topic of this panel? What we see is a momentum that, unless disrupted, will reproduce and perpetuate the problems and perils that failing fast has created. Disrupting this means creating friction. It means pauses for consideration, review panels, for instance, regulatory boards, mandated timelines for staged rollouts, quarantine periods with pathways for public comment, national agencies and formalized review processes. Think drug approvals, but for tech, as Tom Wheeler has proposed in a recent report for the Brookings Institute. By highlighting these, I hope to have a conversation about what it would mean to implement such policies here in Australia, where we're oceans away from the dumpster fire of Silicon Valley, yet insistent, it seems, on sparking from California's flames. I'd like to offer a special thanks to Will Orr, who's now at USC Annenberg School, who was a research assistant when the project started, and to Loren Rester, now a doctoral student in the ANU School of Cybernetics, who is keeping me in line as we speak. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. That was really excellent and perfectly timed, and has left me with a lot of questions that I'm looking forward to asking and things I want to discuss. As I said in the panel, we're going to go through all of them at the start. We're going to go through all of them, and hopefully we can bring together some themes that we can link together. So I'm going to jump straight to Jessie now. So Jessie Liu is a PhD candidate in the School of Sociology here, and I think she's sitting right next door to me in the office, right next door. Prior to her PhD, Jessie completed a double degree in Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Science, and she's currently researching on the infant formula Zygo trade between China and Australia. And I think in this talk is going to be particularly talking about digital labour in this trade, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk, Jessie. So I'll hand it over to you.
So much, Simon. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Sometimes my mic is a little dodgy, so I'll just share my screen. And can everyone see that okay?
I can see half of it.
Oh, good. Just gonna push it a bit. Okay.
That's better.
Awesome. All right, great. I'll get started. So my talk today, so thank you so much for having me, firstly. My talk today is on the infant formula parallel importation trade, also known as Zygo, as it relates to digital platforms and digital labor. And I will speak on 4 main topics today. Firstly, what is parallel importation and Zygo? How does the trade engage with the digital? And what kinds of digital labors do these workers typically engage in? Who typically goes into this industry? And finally, who's benefited from these labors? So I guess I'll start by talking about what is Zygo. So Zygo means Zygo, or parallel importation, as it's often also referred to, has been the subject of to much Australian media attention in the past 6 years, and it's also often referred to in Australia by its Mandarin term, Zygo, which means to buy on behalf. It's
Jessie,
been variously, yes.
So
sorry.
can you just make it a little bit smaller again? Your words are cut off on the screen a little bit.
Thank you.
That's better.
Sorry.
Thank you.
No worries.
Perfect.
And so it's been variously also translated as surrogate shopping, transnational reselling, which capture the defining aspect of the trade, which involve making purchases on behalf of customers who are overseas and then shipping the products to them. The most popular goods that are Zygoed in Australia are infant formula and nutritional supplements. And the shoppers are predominantly women and range from amateur shoppers who take orders occasionally as a sort of side gig to professional shoppers who treat shopping as their sort of primary source of income and career. And while large portions of the trade is offline, doing actual supermarket work, packing packages and things like that, a lot of the labor is also online, predominantly through the mobile app WeChat. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with WeChat, it is a social media app created by the tech giant Tencent, which since its release in 2011 has accumulated about 1.2 billion users globally, becoming the social media app in China with the highest number of active monthly users. It's also very popular in the Chinese diaspora and international student community. And within Australia, there's probably an estimated 3 million WeChat users, though probably only about 690,000 active daily users. And WeChat plays this really big role in facilitating the trade. Shoppers use the one-to-one messaging function, for example, to respond to inquiries about costs, currency conversion, product usage, product expiry dates, product delivery times, to receive orders, send photos or videos of goods in Australian supermarkets as a way to provide evidence that they are really in Australia. Use the one-to-many messaging function. So, you post something and lots of people can see it, which is called Moments in WeChat, which is very much similar to the Facebook news feed. And they make sort of advertorial and ad posts to sort of showcase the products. And they also upload client ID information onto postal and logistics websites through the company's public WeChat account, a process that's required for goods to pass through Chinese customs nowadays. And finally, since 2013, the shoppers also receive money transfers through WeChat and make payments for goods through WeChat Pay, which is now also enabled at Chemist Warehouse. So I could pay directly through WeChat Pay at Chemist Warehouse now if I'm buying infant formula or nutritional supplements. And so I guess I want to talk about next is, this is the kind of work that is being done, but who is actually doing the work? So it's not exactly clear how many Zygo shoppers are in Australia, but it is a really common feminized form of labor within the Chinese migrant community. Many are international students or permanent residents. Others have also come through other visa arrangements, such as working holiday and spousal visas. One of my participants, Stacey, for example, came to Australia through a spousal visa with her husband. And I first met Stacey when she was working in a Zygo shop in Melbourne. And so what a Zygo shop is, and that's a kind of image of what it looks like on the outside, is it's a one-stop shop for both a place that sells the kinds of goods that are most popular in the Zygo industry, like nutritional supplements, infant formula, you can buy them there. And they also provide a postal service embedded in it as well. So you can buy it and you can ship the goods there in one place. And so prior to her working in the shop and moving to Australia, she worked as an administrator in an educational institute in China. And Stacey, like most of the Zygo shoppers I met, was very well educated. All of my participants in this study, for example, have had a bachelor's degree at the very least, so many were in master's, and one of them actually had just completed her PhD in Australia. Stacey herself had an engineering degree from China, but stated she could never use her engineering degree because she had no practical experience as an engineer in China. She said she turned to the Zygo industry in Australia because she was not confident in her English ability. And other shoppers I have talked to have also highlighted that Zygo was one of the few labors that they saw as suitable to them as migrant women, sort of few suitable, sort of easy entry, as they described it, labors that were suitable to them as migrant women, other than the hospitality sector, which was a sector that they saw as full of underpayment or tiresome, and as one shopper described it, dirty work. And I guess navigating their own class position in China, alongside the downward social, occupational mobility, and reduced work opportunities in Australia, as authors like Martin have pointed out, shoppers like Stacey have thus turned to transform their social networks or social capital in China into economic capital in Australia. And unlike an older generation of migrant who may have lost their social contacts in the migration process, it seems, kind of mundane to us today maybe, but Stacey has managed to maintain her social networks in China, and social media apps like WeChat have managed to maintain these networks for her. And these networks are vitally important to the trade because, like the majority of Zygo shoppers I spoke to, Stacey predominantly sold these goods in Australia to her existing social network in China, old colleagues, school friends, relatives, friends of friends, friends of relatives, and that sort. But while WeChat provided access, I guess, to this network, economizing one's social network is actually really intensive and difficult work. The communication service they provide, for example, like answering inquiries, was what the majority of participants told me was really the hardest part of the trade. Participants found the inquiries about products, the demand for authenticating information that they were really in Australia, extremely tiresome. They struggled with clients' messaging without regard for time zone differences and demanding instant answers. And of course, struggled financially with the fact that, these affective communicative labors would be uncompensated financially unless someone bought something, which people often did not. And one of the things I noticed during the course of this research, I guess, is that the communicative labor can be so intensive that many of the Zygo shoppers had their phones on silent because of the constant messaging that they would receive. And this is one of the ways you can tell the difference, I guess, between an amateur shopper and a serious shopper. Amateur shoppers' phones beeped and buzzed because they didn't have enough clients for their phones to be constantly ringing. And so for most people who try Zygo, economizing one's social network becomes quite unfeasible work. Many of the shoppers I talked to dropped out of the trade when they realized how narrow the profit margins were. They dropped out when they realized how many hours they had to work in order to make the trade profitable, how many hours of work yielded no returns. Not all have abandoned the industry. Some have decided to keep Zygo as a side job, for example, only selling to friends of friends. But it seems like many other types of digital workers, influencers in this kind of space, very few shoppers ever develop lucrative careers from Zygo. So I guess the question then is, who has benefited from this trade? In April this year, to backtrack, in April this year, Stacey quit doing Zygo, stating that things was getting too hard. She stated there was not only a great deal of competition, but that there's been this huge decline in demand since COVID-19. The Zygo shop that she worked in has also closed because of lack of demand. Stacey doesn't know what she's going to do next. She's considering getting a certificate in childcare, which another friend of hers who's also did Zygo previously is also turning to. So in the 6 years of reporting, I guess, on the Zygo trade, newspapers have typically centered on the shoppers of the trade and their supposed profiteering and extractive labor of Australian resources. This really common narrative that these newspapers were making were the huge profits that Chinese migrants and international students were making at the expense of Australian babies. And I guess what is perhaps talked about less often are the other actors of the trade, particularly the infant formula companies, something that several of the shoppers that I talked to were cognizant of, and in fact, suggested I look into further. So Zygo shoppers' role as influencers, border brokers, customs service providers, logistics agents played a huge role in propping up many companies' revenues. The transformation of the social networks of Stacey and these other Zygo shoppers, for example, haven't just been a process whereby economic value has been created for the shoppers, it's also created huge amounts of profits and economic value for formula companies, whom have received the most of the profits in this area. And they have benefited disproportionately, probably, from the digital labors of these shoppers. So I wanted to provide a quick example of this by looking at the A2 milk company. So self-labeled trans-Tasman company, A2 Milk Company, is one example. Its infant formula is probably the most popular infant formula Zygo in Australia. Every shopper that I had talked to always mentioned it in our discussions, and A2 has benefited greatly from the Zygo trade. In 2014, their global revenues for infant formula was at 11.1 million New Zealand dollars. And when A2 became popular through Zygo, predominantly between Australia and China, the sales eventually reached 745.1 million in Australia in the 2019-2020 financial year. And in addition, the company's share prices also rose from 0.56 in 2015 to 19.863 in 2020. And since the decline of the Zygo trade during COVID, however, the A2 infant formula revenues in Australia have almost halved to about 357 million. Their share prices have also dropped to 6.29. The A2 Milk Company, which has been quite opaque about their relationship with Zygo, has suddenly, in their most recent annual report, detailed much more openly the integral nature of the Zygo trade to their trade, to explain to their shareholders why they're seeing these revenue drops. However, they have remained extremely unclear about the kind of relationships they have with these shoppers, using terms only such as activating and supporting the Zygo channel to describe the kind of nature of their relationship. And from discussing with another dairy company, which sells infant formula, it seems that Zygo are normally not compensated for their work and are mainly seen as a channel that the companies seek to motivate, be providing very minor financial or non-financial benefits only to the most successful Zygo shoppers. And I guess I want to reflect on how this fits into digital labors more broadly, and how digital labors are conceptualized. So as Gabrielle Lukasz writes on the digital labor of Japanese women in the digital economy in Japan, digital entrepreneurs innovated practices to extract value from labor without actually ever employing many employees, and that much of this exists because of the ways in which digital labors, such as cultivating relationships, posting content, affective labors, such as communicating with fans or clients, are not considered as real work. And as she writes, these labors not only increase the brand's notability by drawing new users onto the platform, they also increase the brand's speculative value by driving up stock prices as well. And while Lukasz is writing and referring to the actual platform in which these women labor in, what I see in the Zygo example is the way in which digital platforms, more than digital platforms themselves, can extract value from Zygo women's digital labor. In fact, non-digital companies might do so too, as we see in the case of Zygo. So on the books, A2 has 335 staff members, yet they've had much more than 335 people providing services for their goods. One shopper even explicitly told me that her work felt like it was free customer service and sales for the infant formula companies, a labor that she nor any of the other hundreds and thousands of traders would ever be compensated for. And so what is the future of the trade? In November this year, the A2 Milk Company has announced they're turning away from the Zygo trade, seeing it as no longer a feasible option. I personally do not know what is the future of Zygo nor these women, but I think these kind of raise really urgent questions for all of us that are invested in this better future for migrants and women and other groups who are often overly represented as precarious digital workers. And I guess what I'd like to maybe discuss later in the panel and open this up is the ways in which Zygo might be read as both part of this decline in the traditional labor relations and the rise of the independent contractor and service providers, but also unique in the sense that the relationship between the shopper and the company are sort of further severed, with risk shifted almost entirely to the shoppers. And I guess what learnings might be here about contemporary digital labor, as well as intervention for policy as well. Thank you. And here are my references. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessie. That was really excellent. And again, I've got lots of questions that I'm looking forward to asking you when we get to our discussion section. So on the, I'll just get, once you've stopped sharing your screen, I will hand over to our third panelist, who is Sean Ward. Sean is a PhD student here at the ANU School of Sociology and is researching moral outrage and linking this in particular in this presentation to the question of networked harassment or online harassment. And I think Sean is going to be presenting some early parts of his research, which I'm very excited to see because we've spoken about it a bit and I'm looking forward to seeing some of these preliminary results around the affordances of online harassment and moral outrage. So I will hand over to Sean.
Yeah, thanks very much, Simon. I'll just get my presentation up. Emphasis on the early factor. This is my first year, so this is all very preliminary and I'm very keen to discuss it further. All right, so yep, as Simon was saying, my name is Sean Ward and I am a first year PhD student at ANU, being supervised by Jenny Davis and Adrian McKenzie. My work broadly looks at exploring the performance of moral outrage on digital platforms. But today I'll be talking more specifically about networked harassment, which we might position as a specific performance of moral outrage. I'll start by going through some of the recent literature on online harassment and networked harassment, and then discuss how my recent application of some of this work adds nuance to these existing models. All right, so Alice Marwick distinguishes between dyadic harassment and networked harassment. Dyadic harassment refers to an instance where one actor harasses another, while networked harassment refers to an instance where many individuals attack a common target. Platform and government policies, Marwick argues, often assume dyadic harassment and neglect to address issues of networked harassment. This is problematic as policies designed to prevent harassment at the individual level often fail to address the complex relations of accountability in networked harassment, as well as the scale of indignation. Before we can begin to develop adequate policy interventions though, we must develop our understanding of how networked harassment occurs. So Marwick describes networked harassment as a process of moral outrage that leads to a normative reinforcement through othering. We can see her model of morally motivated networked harassment pictured. This begins with a target who is accused of a norm violation or violations, which serve as a moral justification for networked harassment. This accusation is frequently constructed by a highly connected account that acts as an amplifier. The amplifier plays a central role in bringing visibility to the controversy. Because the violation and target are constructed in relation to the norms of the networked community, harassment serves to signify collective membership as well as draw symbolic boundaries between communities. Importantly, Marwick emphasizes that it is not simply the action in isolation which serves as the moral violation, but the interrelation between action and the target's attack vectors. These attack vectors are points of vulnerability as viewed by the network community which is engaging in harassment, and serve as points of harassment even if they do not appear to be related intrinsically to the violation. She notes that these attack vectors are most commonly linked to structural systems of misogyny, racism, homophobia, and transphobia, which determine the primary standards and norms by which people speaking in public are judged. So a lot of the recent discussion on networked harassment questions the role of the amplifier in harassment. This particularly seeks to place greater accountability for harassment on these amplifiers for their central role in instigating and spreading harassment. In a study of response videos on YouTube, Rebekah Lewis and colleagues argue that the video creators act as amplifiers that set a blueprint for harassment. These response videos construct the target in violation of a shared morality and highlight vectors for attack. Although the videos themselves may or may not constitute harassment, they provoke moral outrage in the networked audience, which serves as the justification for harassment. These amplifiers, they argue, resultingly play a major role in inciting harassment on YouTube. But the platform and government policy often fails to recognize this accountability. This type of amplification described by Lewis and colleagues highlights the most common construction of amplifiers in contemporary literature. That is an individual account with a large follower base acting as a sort of micro celebrity which informs the actions of a networked audience. Marwick argues that social platforms must recognize the amplifying effect of highly followed network nodes, as those with a larger audience bear a greater responsibility for their online actions. These processes of amplification, though, are entangled with platform affordances and event-specific dynamics, and as such, become more complicated when we look at how network harassment might occur on different platforms. By affordances here, we refer to Jenny Davis's formulation as to how the features of a technology enable and constrain how they request, demand, encourage, discourage, and refuse, and allow across subjects and circumstances. By applying this to different outrage events on different digital platforms, we might begin to draw out a more nuanced understanding of what this process of amplification actually involves. And this is exactly what I've been doing with some of my very preliminary work. I haven't included the data in this presentation, but I will give you an indication of some interesting trends in this preliminary work. So the most basic distinction we might make is between person-based amplification and topic-based amplification. Person-based amplification refers to the type of amplification discussed previously, where an account with a large audience develops a blueprint for harassment. Topic-based amplification, on the other hand, refers to amplification based on what is posted rather than who is posting it. This generally occurs in topic-based communities where there is little hierarchy of communication flows. The community amplifies certain content collectively, meaning anyone could act as the amplifier. Here, person-level interventions are unlikely to be as effective. We may instead require community-level intervention. We can better understand these types of amplification by looking at how different platforms encourage amplification. As previously discussed, on YouTube, we can see a clear example of person-based amplification. The platform encourages this type of amplification by enabling subscriptions to channels and personally aggregating content based on these subscriptions. The subscription button gives the users agency to choose which creators they would like to continue engaging with, having videos from these or similar creators recommended to them. As such, networks of like-minded individuals can gravitate towards creators which stimulate their attachment to issues. On Reddit, we see amplification that more closely aligns with topic-based amplification. Reddit operates through topic-based communities called subreddits. These communities generally discourage the pedestaling of individual users. Instead, content is brought to prominence by collective negotiation through a process of upvoting and downvoting. In most cases, any user's post could reach a very large audience if it aligns with community values. Twitter encourages an interesting mix of topic-based and person-based amplification. Twitter requests the following of individual users and aggregates content for users based on who they are following, which encourages person-based amplification. However, especially in high-intensity events, its aggregation of trending content and hashtags allows the formation of transient topic-based amplification through acute issue publics. In these events, we can see individual accounts without an existing following becoming a coincidental amplifier through the intensity of the event and the affordances of the platform. These coincidental amplifiers end up having a similar role to their traditional amplifier in providing a blueprint for harassment, but do not necessarily have assumed access to an audience prior to the harassment event. This means it's difficult to equate accountability with traditional understandings of amplification. Although these platforms provide a useful foundation for understanding topic-based and person-based amplification, I don't mean to suggest that they have a deterministic relationship with these amplification types. As Hagen and Stauff highlight, each controversy possesses a unique situational context and cultural practices which are entangled with platform dynamics. Platforms encourage different types of amplification and provide different avenues for harassment, but each outrage event is entangled with these affordances in a unique manner. To complicate this further, viral outrage events are rarely, if ever, situated on a singular platform. Controversies move across media platforms. When considering processes of amplification then, we must also consider the overlap in affordances between platform flows. YouTube response videos, for example, could be cross-posted on Reddit to encourage community-based amplification, then further amplified on YouTube through its features for aggregating trending videos. Here we can see a certain overlap in the affordances, bringing an intersection between person-based and topic-based amplification. When we consider how such processes occur at scale with a variety of media objects across a multitude of platforms, we can see how difficult it becomes to disentangle the process of amplification and discern any sort of accountability. So as mentioned previously, this is all very preliminary work and I'm very keen to discuss further. But at this stage, we can draw out several key policy implications. Firstly, the existing literature pushes us to consider the roles and relations of amplifiers, platforms, networked audiences, and contextual factors in processes of networked harassment. Further, we can understand some forms of networked harassment as a boundary-making practice that enforces moral norms and are tied up within the practices and standards of networked collectives. For policy to be effective then, it must recognize these relations of accountability in this process. Secondly, my preliminary work highlights the need to recognize the challenges and complexity in disentangling such relations and describing accountability. We can see that platforms and events might encourage different variations of amplification, which require different interventions. Amplification in harassment events is not simply a person-based process, but instead operates through a complex interplay between affordances, individuals, and event contexts. Each event interacts differently across platforms to form a unique mix of amplification types. Finally, moving beyond simply highlighting the complexities, the discussion of cross-platform dynamics highlights that for any intervention to be adequate, it must target the broader media sphere. Platform-specific policies are certainly helpful. However, the complex interactions and relations between platforms means they are likely to be inadequate on their own. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's so nice to hear your preliminary research or your starting points. I'm very excited. And thank you for being willing to give a presentation in your first year of your PhD. It's very great. So I am presenting the last paper for this session. So instead of introducing myself, I'm just going to get going. So I'll quickly share my screen and this one. And click that button. So thank you everybody again for coming. And in this final paper, I'm going to be looking at the policy, a policy implemented by Reddit called the quarantine, and specifically look at the consequences of how of changing practices in large social media companies who are becoming more active in banning and restricting the use of particular users, particularly on the far right, but it also increasingly happens in other parts of politics. And we're seeing a lot of these bans happening in a range of different social media platforms. So obviously the most high profile of those has been the ban of Donald Trump from Twitter and a range of other platforms at the start of this year. I wanted to have a look in this paper, which has been published, at one example of this and the impacts that it has and whether these bans are effective in achieving what social media platforms want to achieve. So I'll get going and go through some of my findings from this paper. So Reddit is a social media platform news and sharing site that is based off a thing called a subreddit. And subreddits are individual communities established by particular individuals. So anyone can establish a subreddit, and they're normally based on themes and topics. So you have ones ranging from science to media and the arts to TV, politics, a whole range of different topics that are people can start them on. They can be very niche or very broad. What Reddit has done recently has started to increase the use of a function called the quarantine. And the quarantine is a way in which they can restrict access from users to particular subreddits that they have deemed to be shocking or have shocking or highly offensive content, but they restrict access without banning them. And so what this does, there's a number of functions that happen with a quarantine. So for example, Reddit has what is considered a news feed, a front page news feed, which is if you go to Reddit without logging in, you'll see content from the top content from their site overall. So a quarantine community would not appear on those sites. If you subscribe to the community, it disappears from your feed until you go back into it and kind of resubscribe. And then it also is impossible to search through the Reddit function. So you have to know the URL of the quarantine community, type it into your browser, and then you get this message that says, are you sure you want to view the community? The community is quarantined. Are you sure you want to continue? So it creates these barriers of entry point into these particular communities. And when they announced a revamp of this function in 2017, the Reddit announced that the purpose of quarantining communities is to prevent its content from being accidentally viewed by those who do not knowingly wish to do so or viewed without appropriate context. We've also learned that quarantine community may have a positive effect on the behaviour of its subscribers by publicly signalling that there is a problem. These both forces subscribers to reconsider their behaviour and incentivises moderators to make changes. So in other words, Reddit implements the quarantine to communities that they deem to be shocking or have highly offensive material with two purposes. The first is to stop people from accessing the community in the first place, and particularly to stop people accessing it without them knowingly doing so, or unless they knowingly do so, or without appropriate context. And the second is to encourage change within those communities, to encourage people to change their material, as a way to potentially gain access back into the mainstream of Reddit. So in this paper, I'm looking at the quarantining of two particular subreddits associated with my research. These subreddits were quarantined in the middle of my data collection on these two subreddits, which was particularly useful because it gave me some insights into what was happening both before and after the quarantine. These are two men's rights and manosphere subreddits, one called r/braincells, which is a community for incels. Incels are people, men primarily, who believe that due to a range of their own traits, they're unable to gain sexual or romantic relationships, and often take out their failure in this arena in misogyny and violence against women. And the second community that was quarantined was one called the Red Pill. And this is men who use a range of tactics, primarily a tactic called game, which is a highly problematic practice of pickup artistry, and they're highly linked to the seduction community. They use these tactics as ways to pick up women, and it's these tactics have often been associated with highly problematic behaviours and some men who advocate rape. So I was looking at the how Reddit, whether Reddit was able to sort of achieve what they had desired through the quarantine, and some of the consequences of what happened when these subreddits were quarantined. So did the policy work? Well, first of all, we had one thing was that they said that they didn't, that what they wanted was to see a lack of people, a drop in people accessing these communities or not accessing them by mistake. And so we can see here really quickly that this was quite effective in both of these subreddits. So this is a histogram of the amount of comments at a daily basis for each of these subreddits. So you can see on the left there that the Brain Cells forum, it started in 2017, which is why it's quite low at the start there, and then builds up to around about having 10,000 comments a day at one peak. But when the quarantine is implemented for these subreddits in October 2018, or so let's September 2018, you can see that their comment levels drop by about half. This is the same for the Red Pill. We see a bit more of a fluctuating flow of their comment activity during this period. But again, when the quarantine is implemented, they drop by about half, or even a third, less than a third of what their peak was, which was about 1,500 comments a day. So at the initial level, you could see that this was restricting access to these spaces and stopping people from participating. And this drop in activity stays for quite some period. So my data collection ended in January 2019, so I can't go beyond that, but you can see that that it stays low for a number of months. So it's not like it was a short drop that rises very quickly. The second thing we can do, and I've only got one example of this here, and this is for r/the Red Pill, but these findings are similar in r/the Brain Cells as well, is I used what's a technique called LUC, or linguistic inquiry of word count. And what it does is you can upload dictionaries of particular language and it identifies and it goes through data sets and finds that language. And I'm using here a dictionary from Farrell et al., which is I've got in my references, which looks at the number of misogynistic material in each of these, in which they developed a dictionary of misogynistic material. And so what they did is they identified misogynistic terms. They split them into a range of different categories, which you can see here on the left. So belittling, flipping the narrative, homophobia, hostility, patriarchy, physical violence, racism, sexual violence, stoicism, etc. From that, you can then search through a data set and identify how prominent this language may be within a data set. So what I found here is that you can see, I did an analysis of 1 month before the quarantine was implemented and 1 month after the quarantine was implemented. What you can see pre-quarantine and post-quarantine is, again, this matches my data here from previous that shows that there was about a drop in about a half of the amount of comments available that happened in that period. But you can see that while the total number of, that means that the total number of misogynistic material drops. So again, you see in that second column that the total misogynistic submissions and comments drops by about half, the percentage stays the same. So those who participated, who stayed in the community did not change their behavior. So a lot of people left and no longer participated. Well, they didn't even necessarily actively leave. They were sort of just, it's likely these communities just disappeared from their feeds. But then those who stayed still stayed, you still used the same language. Their language didn't change over time. So in terms of the Reddit's goals, we can see that it had kind of mixed goals. So they did stop people from accessing these spaces, but they didn't necessarily encourage change from those who were staying within these communities. And this is what's shown in my third finding, which finds what I would call a bunch of unintended consequences. I'll focus here on r/the-red-pill, but this is found across subreddits that have had the quarantine implemented against them. And what we see is significant anger and backlash against the implementation of the quarantine. Anger and backlash that I argue reinforces many of the beliefs of these communities and reinforces anger directed at large social media platforms. So here is a post, the most popular post about the quarantine from r/the-red-pill, which was posted by a moderator called u/redpill school. He posted, or they posted a long post about the implementation of the quarantine, which was titled 300,000 subscribers, which is how many they had at the time. And the Reddit administration tacitly endorses male abuse and denies its victims. Here in this post, what they did is reinforced the sort of position that men had in this community, that they were the victims of society in general, and that the quarantine was another example of this victimhood where men were being discriminated against for raising true statements, particularly in this instance about male violence and their beliefs about male violence. They particularly here pointed out when they were told that they were going to be quarantined, they were told that they should look at material from Michael Kimmel in particular, who's a key theorist on masculinity studies. They should look at material from him about how to engage in positive masculinity. And then they go through and attack Michael Kimmel, in particular claims that Michael Kimmel that they say that Michael Kimmel has said that men aren't the victims of domestic violence. And this is how they say, well, they're tacitly endorsing male abuse and denying its victims. That's not necessarily particularly true, but this is the kind of narrative that they are developing of them being victims again of society at large, and this being another example of that. What this led to, and this is where I'm most concerned, is a concerted and campaign to direct users away from Reddit and to different platforms. In particular, they had developed their own forum called trp.red, and they engaged in an active campaign to push people to this platform. And so this happened primarily through, so Reddit has a thing called an auto moderator. That is a function that moderators can use. It's a bot that they can use, for example, to reply immediately to posts that are put on the subreddit, which is what happened here. They used the auto moderator to run a campaign against the quarantine and to push users to this external platform. And you can see this here in an analysis I did of URLs of all of the content associated with the term quarantine. So I found any post that had the term quarantine within it, and then isolated the URLs, and you can see a large number of posts being up here, at the top up here, a large number of posts sending people to this trp.red platform. These other two here are also similar versions of that platform, different sites within it. And so we can see a concerted campaign to push people away from the large mainstream platform and to a self-moderated platform, trp.red. And the problem with these self-moderated ones is that they have very little moderation and can result in material becoming even more extreme. And we saw that happening, this campaign, concerted campaign happening from moderators, and it also was sort of felt throughout the individuals as well. So for example, here's a couple of user responses to the quarantine. So for example, on the left, you see real anger at the quarantine, and there's belief that it's being implemented in a hypocritical manner. So someone says it's ridiculous. There's far more misandry or hatred of men in subreddits, in a number of feminist subreddits that they list there. All those subreddits have displayed way more misandry than this subreddit has displayed misogyny. And there are probably more misandric subreddits, yet this subreddit is the one that gets quarantined and probably deleted soon. Men aren't even allowed to criticize women in an online forum, but women can say the most horrible things about men without any consequences. On the right-hand side, you see why and on the right-hand side, we can see sort of a reaction against the idea that this quarantine should result in change in behaviour. And there was a discussion in particular in the brain cell subreddit about changing behaviour. And we see people who say, no, we shouldn't do that. We should be staying isolated. This means that we get to be who we truly are, rather than having these people, as it says in the bottom one, where this subreddit is already too cucked in here, which means too normie, too normalized, and conforming to their wishes will kill this sub more than the quarantine. I'm sure they'll consider pretty much anything critical of women as misogynistic. And so you see those people who stay in these communities sort of hardening their positions and not wanting to back down because of the quarantine. So what this I suggest, and one of the consequences of this, and this is based a quote from more research that has been done on social media, on bans of Reddit, of bans of particular subreddits that found that people moved to other places when they banned. And these authors said that in a sense, Reddit has made these users from banned subreddits someone else's problem. To be clear, from a macro perspective, Reddit's actions likely do not make the internet safer or less hateful. One possible interpretation, given the evidence at hand, is that the ban drove the users from these banned subreddits to darker corners of the internet. And this is a real worry, and it's something that I think is happening as we see the rise in particular of new social media platforms like Parler, Gab, and Truth, which is Donald Trump's new social media platform. We're seeing the rise of this kind of far-right web, in which are spaces that are far less moderated, that allow far more extreme activity, and it happens in more of a kind of bubble. I'm not a big fan of the echo bubble language, but it happens more in a bubble away from these sort of larger spaces that allow it to happen. There are obviously debates and moderation that happen in these communities as well, but these ones are growing. And so what we see is that this kind of hateful material doesn't disappear, it just moves somewhere else. Does that mean that bans shouldn't happen? I don't necessarily think that's the case, but I think we can't think of bans and quarantines as the solution to dealing with these problems, particularly as we see platforms like Gab in particular, which now has millions of subscribers and is growing in its prominence. We have to be addressing the sort of longer term issues as well. I will stop there. There is a bunch of references, and thank you all very much for listening, and I will stop sharing my screen and take off my presenting hat and move into a facilitator hat. We have half an hour to go. So I don't have to talk for a minute. I was wondering if one of the other presenters has a question or anything you would like to ask any of the presenters on the panel. And I'll have a swig of water and then think of my own questions as well.
Well, I'll just jump in and start. Take advantage of the awkward silence so I can ask my questions first. So one thing that struck me, I guess this is one thing for everybody that I'm kind of interested in, is especially, so in all three of your presentations, I mean, I guess especially Jessie and Sean, but also really all three of them, one of the themes that I sort of kept seeing come up was interoperability, or a vast ecology of online and offline platforms that all come together and interact and have not just porous boundaries. It's not like things just go from one to another, but only make sense in their holistic relation. And I wonder if, and it's sort of a broad question, sort of speak to that. Like, how does that holistic relation change the way that we're thinking about policy, but also normative practice on social media platforms? Like, how do we deal with this thing when we've got private companies that form something greater than themselves in combination?
I'd like to answer that first. One of you two.
I'm still kind of thinking about how I would answer that. I suppose something I would say from like a research perspective, this isn't really touching directly on what you've said, but like, I think it's a lot easier for us as researchers to go in and study these individual platforms. So I think a lot of the discussions we've been having have really treated these platforms kind of in isolation. And what we kind of like, I think we've seen from all of our work is what we need to start doing now is really looking at the wider sort of media sphere. We need to like engage in these like cross-platform methods and try and understand how everything is entangled. Yeah, does that, yeah.
My work is a little bit different in the sense that, you know, a lot of Zygo activity happens on WeChat, and WeChat can often operate as quite an invisible platform in the sense that there are no public personal accounts. And so you couldn't find my account on WeChat unless you had my exact username, unless you had a QR code from me, or unless someone who knew me referred my account to you. And I guess, you know, there's this question about inter-platform and the sort of inter-platform work. But I guess there's also this counter side, you know, and the ways in which, like, you know, infant formula companies, you know, benefit from the labors on this platform, and the invisibilities of the labors on this platform because of the way it's structured, because there's no public-private account, means that a lot of this work is unseen or unaccounted for. But at the same time, it's also being strategically used, I guess, by the laborers in this space in order to create senses of relationality between them and their customers. So I guess it's a really complicated question because it depends on whose perspective we take in this instance. And I guess in my case, it's hard to say because I think I would defer to what would the shoppers want in this instance. And, you know, what the shoppers want might also be different. You know, what they might want short term might also be different from how do we organize their labor and how do we better support their working rights. I know that doesn't fully answer the question, but I guess there is a bit of a tension around this question of like inter-platform and the connection with other things, because I guess I just see certain actors as strategically using, even the ones who might not be benefiting from it, strategically using the closure between platforms sometimes, in the case of WeChat, to create a space for themselves where they might do work. And so what I mean by relationality, is that because everyone is referred to you or connected with you in some ways, because they know your exact username or whatnot, it creates this sense of relationality and trust and accountability towards the person you are selling to, which means that because there's no contract between the two of you, it creates this sense of accountability, semi-accountability. And I think that that means that, yeah, people are using the separation to other things in really strategic ways as well. So that doesn't fully answer the question, but I'm more curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, well, no, it does. I mean, I think that absolutely does, because I think one of the things that you're pointing out is that it's that separation makes sense because it's in relation to more open platforms, right? So its closeness is only considered closeness in relation to more open platforms. So that separation in itself is a function of relationality. So I think absolutely makes sense.
I think what's interesting about all of their studies is that my reading of a lot of stuff, and maybe Sean, you would agree around this, around the idea of network harassment. And I think there is a lot of, maybe not research, but at least public debate that kind of treats the internet as the problem, and that harassment is kind of this new thing that happens on the internet. And in my area, misogyny is something. However, there's something that's almost like misogyny never happened before the internet happened, and that there was never any misogynistic campaigns before the internet happened. And part of what I'm trying to do is say, well, we can't just blame tech. There's major problems within the tech industry, but misogyny doesn't just appear on the internet. It's not like you go online and suddenly become a misogynist or a harasser. There are other functions as well. And so we have to be thinking not just between platforms, but be thinking about the relationship between humans and the platform and the other parts of their lives. You know, we spend a lot of time online, but it's not the only way we interact in the world. And so things that we do online are influenced by things that don't happen, that are offline as well, and vice versa. And so I think we've got to be careful not to just focus, a lot of us are focusing on tech, but to not just focus on tech entirely, because people's lives don't just happen on Facebook or on Reddit or on Twitter. And it's a big challenge for me because I'm researching data on Reddit, but how do I then account for everything that doesn't happen on Reddit for these people who are participating on Reddit, for example?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And I think what we need to recognize is our understanding and how this kind of integrates into our discourse around how we're experiencing harassment on platforms and like displaying outrage on platforms. That shapes how we then enact that, if that makes sense. So something I've been looking at is a lot of these outrage events is talking, a lot of the critical discourse looks at these outrage events and then says these are a product of our the media platforms we're engaging with, and then that kind of shapes the discussion in itself, if that makes sense, and the harassment in itself, what sort of shape that takes.
I was going to ask Jenny a question, but Jenny seems to be moving, so I'll ask Jessie a question instead. Jessie, I guess you kind of concluded your presentation with a question about, where is Zygo going and what's the future of it. I kind of wanted to ask you about regulation or about regulation as a question. And is this, I guess, I wanted to think of this as a version of digital labor. It kind of had some similarities. Some of the things that you pointed out to me seem similar to Uber in some ways, or delivery functions in the insecure work, the reliance on the platform, and how the platforms get something out of it, but the individuals might not get as much out of it. I wonder if you had any thoughts about regulation in this space, and what that might, and how does it matter in particular in your context. And then I think I would like to start with you, but I would like to start thinking about it for the other panelists as well. I just noticed that Adrian was literally asking that question, and then he said, Simon's asking this now. So I'll start with you, Jessie, but I'd like to sort of expand that to other panelists as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would probably make it as distinct from maybe something like Uber, only because, Uber, even though you're considered like an independent contractor, I guess, of Uber, and that puts you kind of in a relationship with the company, whereas here you might not have any attachment in any ways to the infant formula companies, and WeChat, still benefits from your labors in all these ways, but I guess isn't my primary area of focus. I would say that the kind of areas of regulation would probably be around, what is considered labor more broadly and getting recognition of those kinds of things. So and again, it's difficult for me to say because, what I think would be beneficial policy, I don't necessarily think my participants would necessarily agree with me in instances, because some of my participants benefit from having it being unregulated, and having it being something that they can dip in and dip out of very easily, and being in control in their feelings. Some of them, especially the ones who are university students, feeling like they're in control of the trade and that they're entrepreneurs rather than someone who is, selling infant formula that kind of has also benefited the company. So it's a really difficult question, I think, in that sense, because again, the community of people who are doing the trade also varies so greatly in terms of their investments in it. And the most precarious ones are, of course, the ones who are first-generation migrants who are often a bit older, coming on spousal visas and things like that. They often struggle to find jobs in Australia, and I think those are the ones who would really benefit from having their labor visible and organized, and communicating with each other in these spaces, which they often do. But yeah, so it's kind of a tangential way of answering that. It's complicated, and I think that my participants might disagree with me, but I do think recognition of the fact that their labors are digital, and that that companies might create relationships of employees, for example, rather than sort of engaging with their labor as just motivating, or like having events that they might attend for free where they might take photos, is the kind of major kinds of benefits that are given to them. And that's not any kind of security, that's not any kind of protection of the risk they experience in terms of both financial and also emotional stresses of the trade. So that kind of, yeah, tangentially answers your question, but I'm much more keen to hear about what everyone else thinks.
Well, so Adrian McKenzie asked this question of all panelists, which was, I was wondering how panelists think about regulation, does it matter, and how? I feel like you may have felt like you've answered that, Jessie. Do you feel like you've had anything to add upon that? And if not, I'll hand over to Sean or Jess.
No, I think I feel like I've answered that. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I think so too. I just wanted to give you the opportunity just in case. But Jenny or Sean, I'd love you both to answer this, and then I'll have a stab at it too. And maybe, sorry, just before I interrupt, before you answer, Jenny, I know earlier on, Celia also asked the question about the negative outcomes of tech development being attributed to rushing and the speed. So I was wondering if you could think about speed as part of the regulation question.
Yeah, so I think that's a great opportunity to wrap those two questions into one, because I thought Celia's point was really great. So Celia earlier in the chat sort of said, okay, so if we were to slow down, would this prevent some of these harmful outcomes that we've seen so prominently? Or in other words, if we slowed down, would we have better, more socially conscientious tech? And I think that does wrap into then, of course, sort of the point about regulation. What if we regulated, what I sort of said in my presentation, if we were to regulate or mandate friction, right? Like what if we regulated a slowdown? And I think, yes, I do think that would absolutely matter, because when the reality is that we're operating in a market economy, and that corporate actors, who are most of the people who are running social media organizations or digital platforms, are going to be not just motivated by profit, but have sort of a moral imperative to profit, because they have stakeholders, like they have investors. And so it is a cultural norm to move quickly and to break things and to sort of adhere to this agile method. But it also is, there's a structural force at play. And in putting regulations that slow that down are almost going to be necessary, because what you have to do is shift the competitive environment. And so yes, I think it does matter. I think shifting the competitive environment matters and happens through regulation. And left unregulated, people will keep moving fast and breaking things.
Sean, do you have any other thoughts about how do you think about regulation, and does it matter? I mean, it's such a big question when you're talking about things like network harassment.
Yeah, so I think regulation definitely does matter. I think one of the problems I think everyone would recognize is we have a government that doesn't really understand how these dynamics are playing out. And this is why we need, I think, our voices in this discussion, because as Simon highlighted earlier, a lot of this places perhaps too much emphasis on the platform. So we've seen recent regulations that have tried to place, again, too much emphasis on the platform themselves, and they kind of ignored the social dynamics at play and the interactions between social dynamics and platform dynamics. But yes, I definitely do think we need regulation, and I think we need more than just platform-based interventions. I think what we've seen a lot of recently is platform-based interventions, and we really need interventions that are going to target the wider media sphere. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree similar. One of the, I always would get asked this question, and I kind of framed this panel in this way deliberately to start having these conversations. We do get I get asked this question all the time. What do we do? You know, how do we stop this stuff from happening? You know, I think Sean and my work is closely aligned, but you know, obviously, you know, Jessie, you would encounter a lot of racism on these platforms, or racism about these platforms, and you know, that's very closely linked. And what do we do? What do we do is what I get asked all the time, and it's really hard to answer that question because it does feel like, and this kind of goes to the paper that I was presenting, it feels a little bit like whack-a-mole. You sort of, platforms will get rid of one community or get rid of one user, and they pop up somewhere else. They pop up somewhere else over here, over there. And so it becomes really difficult without a holistic picture of the web, but also a holistic picture of why this stuff happens elsewhere as well. And I think that Sean is 100% correct that we have governments who don't understand this. Their recent legislation that they announced yesterday is such a prime example of this. We have legislation that is focusing on anonymity, which is, you know, anybody who has been the victim of online abuse will tell you that they get abused just as much by profiles with faces and names on them as they do by anonymous ones. And we've got a legislation that's focused on defamation, which most online abuse and trolling is in defamation. If I go out and say I'm going to kill you, that's not defamation. Under this legislation, you can't really do anything about it. And it also is very individualistically focused in that you can sue this one person when if you look at, you know, Sean's work, this doesn't happen in that kind of way. It happens en masse quite frequently. And so we have governments who don't quite understand, but I also think we in some ways don't understand fully either how the dynamics play out and how regulation can work in this arena. And so I think we need to be thinking about it a lot more. We are very good in sociology at identifying the problems, and there's lots of things that we can identify that are problems. We also need to be thinking and actively participating in the kind of solution process as well. We have lots of questions that are coming through now, which is really great. Jenny, there's a follow-up from Rob to your answer, which he says a kind of provocative question from him. If tech entrepreneurs in early 2000s were forced to slow down, would Jessie, Sean and Simon have digital platforms that have transformed society to be studying today?
So I love when I get to guess about things and nobody can ever tell if I'd be wrong or not. So thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I do think that there would still be digital platforms. There would more than likely be fewer. They would more than likely be potentially smaller. So I think there would, as a very blanket statement, be less and a little better, right? Like I think a lot of the, you know, the whack-a-mole that Simon is referencing now could have been systematically rooted out early on, and it wouldn't feel quite so much like we were chasing. Would there be as much and as big and as you know, as much money flowing and as much, you know, new stuff coming out? No, probably not. But, you know, for me, I think the balance of that would likely be better than worse, to have less done well than more causing all of this.
We have a couple of methodological questions as well. So one from Gavin Smith, he asks, what are some of your reflections on the various methodological challenges associated with the research you do on digitally mediated relations? I'm going to ask everybody this. And then Anne Lawless has a similar question. She says, I did a short-term study of white power groups in Australia, found it very emotionally demanding, studying hate. It's a tough space to work in. Has this been an issue for our panellist researchers? So I think that might apply to some of us here. So I'm happy to maybe, on the methodological question, I'll start with you, Sean, if you've got some thoughts.
Sorry, I was just rereading the question.
What are some of the methodological challenges you're facing?
Okay, yeah. So, well, one of the challenges I've been facing recently is dealing with digital data, and it's because I'm looking at kind of this interaction between the social and these platforms, and it's this idea of kind of like trying to work out what is my object of study. Is it the social phenomenon, or is it the dynamics of the platform, and how do I kind of blend my methods to draw out both of those both of those dynamics adequately. And I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. I still don't really know how I'm going to do that, but I think it's a really important point of discussion. Yeah.
Jessie?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I guess this is probably not a surprise in any way. I guess the main challenges, ethical challenges, not just in terms of the ethics board, but also, you know, personally, what can you look at and what can you not look at? And I think it's really difficult in the kind of Zygo space I'm looking at because, you know, you're looking at someone's social media feed and they're posting ads, which are supposed to be as public as possible. They want people to see it, but because they also have to, you know, this has been written about before in like Zhao's research, for example, in 2020, you know, because they want to present, which they are, present the sense that they actually are in Australia. Their social media feed is also coupled with, you know, ads and then images of them in Australia, enjoying Australian scenery and things like that. And so, you know, these boundaries between what is work and what is not work are also blurred, both for you and for them, I think, as well, and what you can and can't look at, and what is part of their Zygo work and what is not. And so I think these, yeah, you know, are real ethical challenges for researchers in terms of what they can and can't look at, and what they shouldn't look at as well, and what shouldn't be part of research, and consent and all of these processes and how we negotiate that, especially when it comes to things like images and text. Yeah.
I will add to that as well, is one of the things I think, you know, both what Sean and Jessie have said are definite challenges. Another one that I add into that is scale. For me, it's been quite a challenge. You know, for my data set, I've collected data from only 3 subreddits, and to give you a sense, Reddit has thousands of subreddits. I've collected data from 3 subreddits that across 14 months of that data analysis, and I have over 3 million comments, 3.7 million comments, something like that, which is a huge data set. And that, for me, is this tiny snapshot of everything that has happened in this space. And it's scale then that gets matched with speed, and that things are changing so quickly and change so quickly and are happening and develop so fast. I find myself constantly feeling like I'm not keeping up to date in my field because there's so much material being produced by these people every single day. And, you know, I kind of highlighted this in my platform, of these new platforms that are in my presentation, these new platforms that are developing all the time. And sometimes I get asked questions about, oh, what do you think of this new platform? And I'm like, I didn't even realize there was another new platform out. And it goes, you know, and there's so much going on. And so sometimes that's a real challenge that I think comes with this space. How do you collect the data? How do you analyze such a size? How do you then do the scaled analysis? And then how do you keep up with it? It can all be a real challenge. And I find that really difficult all the time. Jenny, do you have any thoughts on methodological points?
I just to build on what you just said, and also as a callback to Rob's earlier question, I would say that had the early entrepreneurs of the 2000s been slowed down and produced fewer platforms, then Simon's life would be a lot easier right now, as would Sean's, as would Jessie's. Advocating again for the slow method.
I think it's also, I had a really good question from Anne about how to manage like this scenario. I think one thing I would say is that a lot of this research isn't for everybody, and that you do have to have a little bit of a thick skin to be able to read some of the material that you read online, but also just have good social networks of your own, and good supervisors and a good school, and people who can provide support and who can talk about it and come in it with a sort of sociological mindset can be really valuable in understanding and analyzing with a framework for like, I want to change this, rather than I'm just going to read it constantly with the kind of the effect that can have on your own emotions. So it does certainly have an effect on my emotions. In fact, one of the things that has impacted me the most in many ways, I've kind of, whilst recognizing it as being awful, I've kind of become used to, sadly enough, some of the misogynistic material. That doesn't mean I think it's not any good or anything like that. It just kind of, I read it and it happens. But some of the stuff that I find I get surprised by things. So in the places that I've looked at, one of the communities, the incel community in particular, has a high number of suicide notes, and that really shocked me when I found it, because I was so surprised by it. I wasn't expecting it, I think, and that changed my dynamics and the way I thought about those spaces. Whilst also dealing with all this kind of misogynistic stuff that's happened at the same time, it's kind of added this extra layer of awfulness in these communities. And so having good social networks of your own, and talking to other people about it, and thinking about it through the lens of how can we change this has been things that have helped me a lot. I'm not sure if others have thoughts about that.
I looked at a lot of racist content early on in the PhD, and I was advised by my supervisor to not. And at first I was like, oh, I don't know, it feels important to understand. And now I'm very grateful for that comment, I think. And that, you don't have to have everything in your project. And that sometimes it's good to step away from things that might, projects change all the time. That's a natural part of projects. And that, yeah, it doesn't have to be a project that captures absolutely everything. And you don't have to understand every perspective or every voice, and that you can focus on what you think are the important voices within a space. And for me, that was the shoppers' perspectives and their experiences and their life journey, I guess. Yeah.
Sean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, because I'm looking at Outrage like a particularly high intensity event, and I would say actually before I started my research, I experienced, and I don't know if everyone else did here, but a degree of outrage fatigue, because it seems like every time, and I enmesh a lot of my life in these digital spaces, and it seems like all the time I'm experiencing these high intensity emotions and seeing these very high intensity comments. So I think this actually started before I started my research, and now I'm just completely kind of desensitized, I suppose, to the experience. Yeah.
For me, I totally have that experience, and I think actually doing the PhD has allowed me to step back from that constant cycle a little bit, particularly because through the analysis I've seen that the cycles repeat themselves, and that they happen a lot. And that doesn't mean they're not harmful to the individuals who are the other end of it, but it has given me some space to be able to step back and go, I can observe this through the lens of analysis, and again through trying to change it, and stop my own engagement with it at the same time by having kind of a slow response to it, as Jenny would advocate, I think. We have 3 more minutes. We had Sean, there was a couple of questions for you actually, which I might just pile give you these 2 questions at one go. So one is from Rob in the Q&A section, and he says, is your research going to involve you studying particular instances or episodes of harassment? How are you going to determine when an exchange or thread involves harassment rather than, say, robust exchange? What might be considered harassment in some settings may not be in others. So how are you going to observe this? And there was a second question, I think, I've just lost track of who it was from. And that was about whether you see harassment, versions of network harassment happen offline as well as online.
Yep, so to Rob's question, the first one. So my research is more broadly focusing on outrage, and I think that encompasses harassment. I'm not so much trying to define harassment in my research, contrary to what I've kind of been presenting today. I've been trying to talk to the existing dynamics, and I think all those things you've highlighted there are completely right. So I'm positioning outrage, and I'm aware that I have to say this very quickly, but as a boundary making practice that can encompass lots of different types of performances, one of which could be harassment, but you could also see more pro-social action as manifestations of outrage. On the second question, I absolutely think you could apply this to non-digital environments. I think looking basically at the model, you can see that it could absolutely work in non-digital environments. I think what digital environments do is they change the scale of the interaction, and they make it more visible to other people. So with that comes a different scale of indignation, a different level of intensity. But again, this is very hard to conclusively kind of say. We have to look at the dynamics between platforms and how they're interacting with independent social events rather than making concrete statements. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we're right on 3:30, which means I think we need to conclude this panel. And I want everyone to give, please, a really big round of applause to our panelists. I really enjoyed that. That was a really great session. Maria, are you hopping on to tell people admin for the next?
Look, thank you very much, Simon, for chairing that session too. That was fabulous. Look, I just actually wanted to let everyone know that we have a 15-minute tea break now. So that's apparently only just been wasn't in the official program, but from 3:45, we'll start the book launch. So I hope to see some of you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.